The cRPG is one of the oldest video game genres ever, tracing its lineage back to the pen and paper RPG Dungeons & Dragons. Back when they were more common, the cRPG allowed those without the time or friends to set up a real game of D&D to get a similar experience, albeit that of a player rather than the dungeon master. It is very difficult to overstate the impact that Baldur's Gate has had on the industry. It was the first game that BioWare ever made, and the first to showcase the Infinity Engine, which would become the basis for many more cRPGs after it, including Planescape Torment and Icewind Dale. With such a legacy to look up to, I went in with high hopes, but the question in my mind was whether or not that expectation would be justified, so without further ado, let's dive into it. Since the game abides by a real-time version of the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons rule set, how the game works can be confusing for those who aren't familiar with it, so let's go over the important details. If you already know how the game works, feel free to move on, but otherwise prepare for a lot more information than you probably need. When you create your character, you have a lot of different options, which will affect what you can do from both a gameplay and story perspective, and going through these will best help you understand the intricacies of the game. Your gender is mostly cosmetic, though it can change what some people say to you. Picking a different race will affect what classes you can play as, and again change how people treat you. So if you're unsure as to where to start, playing as a human is a good fallback. The next thing to worry about are the classes. Fighters do what you would expect, being good at combat but not much else. Rangers are good archers, though can also be proficient in melee combat. Paladins are holy warriors that are good in combat but also have some clerical abilities and other powers to help the party as a whole. Thieves are good at disarming traps and picking locks, while not being as proficient in combat unless they're able to get behind their opponent. Bards are jovial characters who are the jacks of all trades, master of none. Clerics and druids both have healing spells, with the former focused on holy magic and the latter focused around nature, though there is plenty of overlap. Magi are magic users who have the option to specialize in different kinds of magic, such as a necromancer for summoning the undead and invokers for raw magic. Some races can also do something called multi-class, which will mean you split your experience gain for two different aspects, such as being a fighter and thief or fighter and mage. This will force you to deal with any restrictions from either class, but it's good if you want a character that wants to focus on two similar things. There's also something called dual class that allows humans to change their class mid-game, allowing you to keep all of your perks and restrictions of the old class, but sending all of the experience into a new one. Don't worry too much about dual class or multi-class on your first attempt, however, as it can be a bit weird until you figure out how the game works. Once that has been decided, you have to choose your alignment, which will have an effect on how you wish to play your character. These are broken up into two distinctions, lawful versus chaotic and good versus evil. Lawful people are focused on maintaining order and obeying the laws of the land, while chaotic people are more flexible and individualistic, often hostile towards any and all authority. Good and evil are pretty much what you would expect. Are you more selfless or selfish? To explain this system, a chaotic good person can be a vigilante, unpredictable and working above the law but wanting to do the right thing. A lawful evil person can be a greedy businessman, who uses the law to the fullest in order to benefit himself the most, regardless of the consequences to others. Next, you get to choose your attributes, which will have wide-reaching effects on your character's statistics throughout the rest of the game. Strength affects how much damage you deal in fights and how much you can carry in your inventory. Dexterity affects your accuracy with ranged weapons, how hard it is to hit you, and influences general hand-eye coordination. Constitution affects how many hit points you have, and how resistant you are to some negative effects. Intelligence affects a character's memory and ability to learn. Wisdom affects a character's common sense and judgment. Finally, charisma affects your looks, your ability to lead, and be persuasive in general. When you actually enter combat, it's fairly simple. Everything in the game happens in real time, though you can pause at pretty much any time. Because of this, the focus is on how much you can do within a certain length of time, be it moving, attacking, or casting spells. Every character has at least 2 slots for weapons, which are usually used for 1 melee and 1 ranged, though most fighter classes have more. The toolbar below is the most useful one to use during combat, as it will allow you to do all sorts of stuff. If your right mouse button is too convenient, you can have your characters attack enemies, talk with others, or guard, which will cause that character to defend your target. Spells are handled by this tab, which allows you to use any memorized spell available. The tab right next to it is used to access item-specific abilities. Next to that are your quick items, 3 slots that allow you to use potions, wands, and magic scrolls without having to look directly at your inventory. Finally, some characters have specific spells that they alone can access. Because D&D's combat is focused around dice rolls, risk and reward are the main decisions you'll make before and during combat, though it can be hard at first to understand what's going on since a lot of these rolls are done behind the counter. Armor class helps determine how likely a hit will land, savings throws determine whether or not certain spells or attacks will take effect, and there is a set range of damage that each weapon or spell can do. The first number determines how many dice will be rolled, and the second number determines the type of die, or maximum number that one die can reach. A 2d4 will use two 4-sided dice, while a 1d10 will use one 10-sided die. The former is more reliable, as it will never deal below 2 HP, while the latter has the potential for higher damage, so do you go for more reliability or higher edge case? Beyond that, when you fight and defeat something or complete certain actions in the game, you gain experience as a party, with the number you see being divided between each character. As you would expect, gain enough experience and you're able to level up, giving you a significant stat boost, increasing the number of spells you can use, and improving any thief skills you have available. Apart from that, the rest is fairly self-explanatory. If you just came from my overview, then you might understand why, at first, my opinion of the game wasn't very high. Even as someone who played Baldur's Gate 2, I wasn't prepared for the amount of complexity they threw at me early on. As an example, the first character I drafted, and the one I completed the game with, was a cleric. On the first major quest, I had a lot of trouble where my character was basically getting one-shot by kobolds whenever they were shooting arrows at me. Part of the reason was because I had opted for more strength since I was anticipating using a mace or flail. But I hadn't anticipated what standing there would entail, and how many people would be gunning for me as a result. That meant that while I might have had the strength to land a solid blow, I didn't have the constitution to stand there for very long. There is a lot of nuance to the gameplay that you don't necessarily notice unless and until you get your hands dirty, and that was something that followed me for much of the game. Yet, part of it was also due to an inconsistent difficulty curve, as depending on where you explore, what side quests you complete, and how quickly you get to the main story, your mileage may vary. Even within the same area, there is a decent amount of variation, as if you go into the wilderness, you can encounter a couple of stray bandits or gnolls, which aren't too hard to deal with, to an ogre berserker who can make mincemeat out of most low-level adventurers. The experience gained and difficulty between them is huge, made even more noticeable since what monsters you encounter are determined at random, even if you go back to a slightly older save. As always, rule number 1 when playing any old game: save early, save often. Even though the difficulty can be inconsistent, the game was designed to be open-ended, so I'm unsure as to how it could have been addressed. I mentioned my adventures with the kobolds because I was progressing through the story rather quickly, having reached chapter 2 without hitting character level 2 on most of my party. That meant, disregarding the fact that I didn't know what to expect down there, going to fight whatever lay below might have been a mistake, because you are rather weak at level 1, and perhaps I should have gone to do a side quest or just explored around more. The problem is that in this kind of RPG, the gameplay is just as important as the story, characters, and exploration, so since I was more interested in the main objective, I made a beeline for it. Having to grind enough just to where I can take a hit or two seems like it shouldn't be necessary. Most of us aren't coming to a cRPG for the most focused story ever, but it almost feels like the game punishes you a little bit for wanting to get to it right away. To some extent, it's part of the limitation of having the computer serve as the dungeon master. You can save progress and try again, but you also can't bargain with a person to make sure everything will work out. The best stories I heard from my dad and friends who play D&D are the ones where everyone got out barely alive, despite or perhaps because of some haggling behind the counter with the DM. And I did have some of those moments, but only after I got a few hours into it. I shouldn't have gone into a mine full of kobolds that could one-shot me with a bow and arrow, but at the same time, I feel the game could have given a more direct warning to not enter the area until I was ready. At this point, I'm chalking it up to my stupidity. Your best chance to be in good shape is to have your party's characters at or above the same level as the chapter you're currently in. There are so many side quests and monsters to face that there isn't a huge problem, apart from, again, very early on. And there are plenty of places to sell what you find, though scouring every area you come across can be a bit tedious. There is a lot to explore and a lot to see, but it often feels like you have to scour an entire part of the wilderness just to find the awesome moment. In principle, I don't have a problem with it, but the map is, in many cases, unhelpful. It's usually not a problem in the open country or a small town, but when you get to a more condensed area, especially in the city of Baldur's Gate, then it can be really hard to find what you're looking for. I will admit to using a wiki to find out where I was supposed to go for some of the quests, partially defeating the purpose of stumbling onto something interesting, but also because there's only so long that I can stand to run around in circles. As for leveling your characters, a lot of it is done behind the counter, with very little player input. Not that leveling up is insignificant, as it does help your party quite a bit, but you don't often realize the impact until you get back into combat. Even though the leveling experience is virtually non-existent, the combat is really robust. Outwardly, it's simple, but once you start experimenting with what you have, it can be really engaging. There are a lot of different options available to you, both in terms of offense, defense, and so on, to where there are a lot of different ways to play. Your options while in combat can be relatively limited, since the getting hit while casting a spell will often cancel that spell, so it's much more about planning than execution. That's not necessarily my cup of tea. I prefer to get my hands dirty and come up with intricate plans on the fly, but I can definitely respect the way the mechanics operate. It's a little too reliant on dice rolls for my liking, but again, I usually preferred to enter the fray before thinking everything through, which meant I was often sloppy, which meant I probably relied on those dice rolls too often. However, the unit pathing makes the combat much harder to manage, as if there is even a chance of something being in the way, you will end up waiting for longer than you should for everything to be okay. The loot you find is also pretty good, as are the quests that you go on to find said loot. I ended up building sword collections due to long stays away from a place to sell them, but there's enough other loot to where you don't mind picking up yet another short sword. There are a lot of interesting items, made even better by the fact that many of them have their own stories in the description. Just remember to identify your equipment before you put it on, otherwise you could end up with some interesting side effects. As for the other one, of masculinity/femininity. The Cursed Girdle of Femininity and Masculinity, a rare yet oft-discussed magical item, is wrought with the most powerful magic. Anyone unfortunate enough to secure it around their waist instantly finds their gender to be transformed. It is said that not 50 years past, a nameless court jester was beheaded for presenting the girdle as a gift to Duke Lobalan's lover. The most interesting part for me was the content added with the expansion, Tales of the Sword Coast, as one of the areas added was Durlog's Tower. In many ways, it represents what is, to me, the best and worst parts of the game. Best because the story driving your investigation is fascinating, and there are a lot of good encounters in it. Without giving away too much, tragedy befell the family that lived there, leaving behind plenty of loots and traps to guard what remains. As you keep exploring, you slowly learn more about what happened and why Durlog would become so paranoid as to make his home a death trap. However, it's also in many ways the worst, because it takes so long to get through that it almost overstays its welcome. There is a lot to like, but by the time you're at a high enough level to play it, the main story has really picked up, and as I was playing, I couldn't help but think, you know, I have some rather important stuff that I should probably be looking into instead of crawling through this tower. It didn't help that every time I seemed to find my way to the end of a level, another one seemed to follow in its wake, and there was so much there that my loot OCD kicked in, making every new treasure trove a bittersweet sight. I had to have everything, but I couldn't necessarily pick up everything, which made getting through the dungeon a lot more tedious. Despite that, each level stands out in my mind because of how different they are, and that alone is great, adding to the suspense as you keep learning more and passing new and varied challenges. They're very well constructed, both from a story and mechanical perspective, and it's hard not to appreciate that. If you can put your worries regarding the main plot aside, it's a great addition. Each level also highlighted the strength of the art and in-game graphics, which hold up pretty well. The small resolution can be a bit annoying, especially since you're scrolling through relatively large areas, but the artwork itself is great. The cinematics suffered due to outdated 3D graphics, but the cinematography more than makes up for it. Most of them are used to introduce new areas, and for what they are, they do well enough. The music is also nice to listen to, though it can get a bit repetitive at times, especially when you're exploring part of the wilderness. The main focus of these kinds of games, however, is the story, so let's take a look at it. The game takes place in the Sword Coast as part of the Forgotten Realms, a fantasy setting which has been used for multiple pen and paper and digital campaigns over the years. Your journey begins in Candlekeep, a citadel that holds the largest known collection of books and knowledge in the region, possibly even the world. Ever since you remember, you've lived there, studying and playing within the citadel under the tutelage of your adopted father, Gorion. Due to an iron shortage and suspicions of evil wandering across the land, Gorion urges you to pack what little you have and leave with him. Unfortunately, Disaster comes upon you in your travels, as Gorion sacrifices himself so that you can get away. Accompanied only by what little instruction you have and maybe one of your friends from Candlekeep, you venture off to hopefully figure out who you are, what is going on in the region, and why your attackers would be willing to go through a powerful mage to get to you. Going in, I was a little worried because I had played a decent amount of Baldur's Gate 2 and know how that story resolves. So that meant I knew what would happen to some of the characters, and I knew one of the major plot reveals. However, apart from that origin story, most of the important things the sequel addresses happen between the two games. So apart from some character familiarity, there isn't too much to worry about. Because of how open-ended the game is, there is a lot of variance in what quests you complete and when you complete them. The main plot doesn't change too drastically regardless of the actions you take, but it was able to hold my attention the whole way through. Even as you're exploring, stuff that you find in people you interact with can change how you look at the story. There were a couple of really good plot twists which were made all the more powerful because I had talked to people and gotten to know them better. What I found most interesting about the way the story was told is that your journal, where important information is recorded, doesn't work like a typical quest log, but is far more organic, giving you a peek into the mind of your main character. The lack of an outright quest log can be off-putting, but I actually liked it. With many open-ended games, I tend to get overwhelmed if there are a lot of arrows pointing in different directions, each with something to do. But by having you read through the journal, it gives you time to reflect on what you've seen thus far, which in and of itself helped my investment in the main plot. Beyond the journal itself, there are multiple ways of finding the information you're looking for. Once I reached Nashkel, a mining town where you begin investigating the iron shortage, there were two main plot lines based on what the townsfolk were discussing: the trouble in the mines, and some business with the former captain of the guard. The former I knew about and took care of quickly enough, but the latter was interesting because I got different information from different people. Depending on who you talk to, the outcome of that quest can change drastically, acting as a tangible example that your choices can and do matter. I won't go into too many specifics because it's worth experiencing on your own, but it was satisfying to see the ending that I hoped for. Even the most random things that happen as you carry on your way can be fascinating in and of themselves. While returning to Nashkel after resolving their mining problem, I ran into an old man who, after giving him a hilariously long dialogue option, gave me some tidbits to help me understand who I was. One of these was a strange phrase: "Your coin is on its edge." On its own it doesn't mean anything, but if you know about Timora, the goddess of luck, it is said that whenever someone is born, she flips a coin to determine whether that person will be fortunate or otherwise. However, there are some rare exceptions where, instead of landing on one face or the other, the coin lands on its edge, giving the person affected more freedom to choose their destiny. Small tidbits like that are scattered throughout the game, and even in what I received from the old man, there's almost definitely something I haven't picked up on. On their own, these would serve as a good anchor to the plot and our involvement in the world, but the game also takes it a bit further. After certain events, a new chapter begins, each one giving you some exposition from a narrator to help contextualize what's going on and give you a new main objective. The voice acting throughout is serviceable, as the game is much more focused around written text rather than voice acting. Some of the NPCs and party members reuse lines more than they probably should, but it's not completely immersion breaking. Apart from the narration and other sparse voice acting, you also have narrated dreams, which provide the most direct way your choices can impact your character. Your reputation and how you've been acting will determine what the dreams will be about, which create very different tones depending on whether you've played more as the hero or the villain. They aren't terribly substantial, but the narration helps distinguish it from the rest of the story and the ton of reading you'll end up doing. Speaking of reading, since this is a cRPG, there is a lot of it, and the writing is really good. The books and scrolls you find are well written, either taking advantage of the Forgotten Realms setting or reflecting the game's current narrative really well. The characters are consistent, and react in a believable manner depending on how you approach them and what you've been up to. The dialogue options are often diverse enough to allow you to get the information you need in an organic way, though there were plenty of times where I felt like I was choosing the lesser of two evils. Playing a pure good or pure evil character is really hard because of that, but the rest of the dialogue is solid, so I have very little to complain about. The game also has a decent sense of humor, as there are quite a few silly moments scattered throughout, making fun of D&D tropes, RPG stereotypes, characters in the world, and so on.
By Moradin's hammer!
I thought I asked you to clean the rats out of this building yesterday already. Hop to it, get in there!
Reaver has once again pressed me into service in his storehouse.
All reports suggest that our feline forces have turned traitor, and that the rats are on the offensive. It appears that I am our last hope in the face of such an awesome display of power. Farewell, dear journal. Farewell.
Your life ends here. By Moradin's hammer.
Ah, yes, kill them like the rats that they are. A glorious battle unlike any this world has ever seen. Here's 5 gold. Don't spend it all in one place. Mental note. Don't join the armed forces. They never inform you of the full danger when you enter, and they always pay you squat when you leave. Reefer gave me all of 5 gold pieces for putting my life on the line in there. Isn't there a Candlekeep People's Revolutionary Front I can join somewhere?
My biggest complaint is that the game seems to actively punish you for hanging on to the same party members for long periods of time. After a while, I settled on a party which I kept through pretty much the entire game. But apart from your first interaction with them and possibly a quest or two, there isn't much reason to hang on to anyone. Party members might give some dialogue here and there, some of which can be amusing, but there were many times while I was playing where it felt like I wasn't getting the full experience because I wasn't trading out party members for different quests. They don't feel like characters as much as they do character sheets. It's not like they have zero personality, but the small quips that each one might say depending on the circumstances didn't feel like enough. Along with that, despite the many paths I mentioned, there is only one final destination. The build-up doesn't pay off as much because of that, and it doesn't resolve everything in the manner I hoped for. To some extent, what happens works into who your character is and the circumstances you find yourself in, but to go into further detail, I'll need to venture into spoiler territory. Feel free to skip if you have any intention to play this game, as there are some really good moments in this story that are worth seeing for yourself. The main character's parentage is kept hidden for much of the game, but we eventually learn that he or she is a child of Baal, the late god of murder. According to an ancient prophecy, Baal foresaw his death and in preparation for it, scattered across the realms what is referred to as a score of mortal progeny. Part of this connects to the one behind the Iron Crisis, Sarevok, who is also a child of Baal and thinks he can ascend to become the god of murder by carrying out the last part of the prophecy. Chaos shall be sown by their passing. In order to do this, Sarevok has taken over a merchant group called the Iron Throne, using them to create the iron shortage, which he could then peg on their neighbors to start a long, bloody war. The only person capable of stopping him, however, is you, because as a child of Baal yourself, you have the potential to match him in power and keep him from achieving his goal. What's great about this setup is that we don't really know that Sarevok is behind all of this for much of the game, and when you do figure it out, everything falls into place beautifully. Since that I knew that my character was a child of Baal before playing this, I got to see and admire how they built it up, through the characters you ran into, the dreams, and even just the random chanters you come across in Candlekeep. That's not even going into how much trouble Sarevok has gone to in order for this to be a success, putting so many people between your party and himself, making every bit of gained ground a hard-earned battle. Which leads me into the second plot reveal, the doppelgangers, who are effectively shapeshifters. On investigating the Iron Throne and one of their competitors, the Seven Sons, we find out that they've been infiltrating both merchant groups' ranks, hoping to destabilize the Sword Coast by manipulating trade in the region, especially by inciting the Iron Crisis. That's all well and good, well, sort of, but then we really learn how far their corruption went, going so far as to take on the faces of those we knew at Candlekeep. That revelation alone threw my entire understanding of my character's childhood out the window. So far as I can tell, we're never told when they began to take over the place, so when did the switch happen? How did that affect our lives growing up, if at all? Did Sarevok send them in to give Gorion reason to leave so that he could pick us off? Or was there a different reason for Gorion leaving and Sarevok finding us there was a coincidence? Was the person who sent the letter urging us to leave a doppelganger and the whole thing is set up? The fact that I'm still not sure what exactly happened, even after having plenty of time to think about it, is tribute to how much of an impact that surprise had. Still, when you get to the final confrontation, I have to admit that it feels anticlimactic. Sure, it's a tough fight and a long time coming, but our fate in relation to Baldur's Gate isn't addressed, the final cutscene, though well constructed, doesn't tell us much about our own fate, and it just feels like after you start chasing him directly, the plot just doesn't have the same weight anymore. You spend all this time finding out who the mastermind is, then the actual confrontation is dragged out by a maze, another expansive area, and then we get to kill him. For the most part, I was okay with the amount of filler versus the amount of killer, but this is the one place where I felt it got in the way of the plot and hampered its impact. Overall, there is a lot to like. The combat is well constructed, there's a lot to explore, and there's a lot to interact with. The main plot is engaging throughout, the side quests and characters you meet are interesting, and the locations are diverse enough to stand out despite relying on very similar art assets. And yet, while I was playing this and thinking about what to say, I couldn't help but think back to all of the technical problems, missed opportunities, and other miscellaneous problems that seemed to be a constant thorn in my side. In many ways, Baldur's Gate is what I wanted out of Skyrim, an open-world RPG which understands how to give your actions weight, to make you feel like you're making a difference in the world. Skyrim had a lot to offer based on the time I spent with it, but it felt like nothing I did mattered, while in Baldur's Gate the writing prevents that from being an issue. By that standard, I should love the game, but there's still that reservation, that lingering thought that something's missing. It wasn't until I started to replay the sequel that I realized why I feel this way. Everything that I wanted from the original was there. The technical improvements, party interaction, and the improved usability pushes Baldur's Gate 2 from a good game to an amazing game. That's not to say that the original isn't good, as while I can't recommend it as a first venture into the RPG genre, for those who already love RPGs or Dungeons & Dragons, it's a good investment. In the end though, developing this game alongside the Infinity Engine did noticeably hamstring it. While I will always respect the game as an important landmark and admire what it accomplished, when judged purely as a game, it will always be overshadowed by its sequel. And frankly, given how far RPGs have come since then, I think that's a good problem to have. You can find everything related to Baldur's Gate over on GOG. Just bear in mind that since this runs on the Infinity Engine, the gameplay is tied to the frame rate, so unless you run it at double time, you're going to be stuck at 30 FPS. It's not unplayable, but it's worth mentioning for those who care about such things. That's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and keep an eye on this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not so regular basis. To think I even managed to go through this entire review without mentioning giant miniature space hamsters. What kind of a gamer am I? And don't you expect me to explain that. That's something that needs to be seen to be believed. Until we meet again.